Please, brothers, spread out a little bit. That was a message from the administration so that we could try to control the whole issue with COVID a little bit. Bismillah, alhamdulillah, wa salatu wa salam ala rasulillah. يا ربنا افتح لنا أبواب رحمتك وعلمنا ما ينفعنا. أما بعد. We wanted to focus a little bit on the whole issue of the command of the Quran with regard to the meaning of da'wah as we find it in Surah Al-Nahl. Allah Tabaraka wa Ta'ala in Surah Al-Nahl we find an ayat in which Allah Tabaraka wa Ta'ala is commanding to the da'wah. Ud'u ila sabili rabbik. Let's stop there for a minute. And a lot of times when we hear the mention of the da'wah being made, we give it the meanings that we want to give it. But here in the Quran, in this context, it means to call to Islam as a whole. And one of the things that's interesting here is that Sheikh Hudson al-Nadwi, who was known as one of the leading people of da'wah from the Desi community, he talked about this ayah and he says that this ayah doesn't restrict itself. So when we talk about the issue of human rights, when we talk about the issue of tawheed, when we talk about the issue of good manners, when we talk about the issue of reminding the people of al-akhirah, whatever meaning that's there from the deen itself is contained in the meaning of da'wah. And that is a game changer when we talk about what the da'wah is. Another thing that he says that's extremely important when we talk about asalib al-da'wah, the different means by which we approach the da'wah, is that he takes the position that is not restricted to just one means. And so we have to pause for a minute and think about the reality of this surah when it was revealed. It was revealed, the context of this ayah comes in the surah. The surah was revealed in Mecca at the last stage of the da'wah in Mecca, while the Muslims were being forced out and some went to Habasha before they go into Medina. Now when you think about that reality, the Muslims were being persecuted. The Muslims were under boycott. The Muslims were tortured. They were going through all kinds of suffering, and then the Quran is coming with this reality. What's the natural human instinct? If you have opposition and you're under pressure, the natural human instinct is to want to get revenge or want to get your right, want to establish yourself. But here the Quran is teaching the believers the way that we should operate. ادع إلى سبيل ربك بالحكمة والموعظة الحسنة. Keep composed and call to the way of Allah, to the deen of Allah, to Islam. And remember that the Quran is still being revealed here. And remember that now the Muslims, a portion of them that couldn't take the pressure of being in Habasha, now they have to confront going into Africa, dealing with the Christians in Africa. And we know that Quraysh, they wanted to tarnish the image of Islam. Not only did they want to tarnish the image of Islam, They wanted to make sure that the Muslims didn't have a position anywhere on the face of the earth, that there was no land, that there was no space, that they would exist. They took every diplomatic measure that they had to make sure that they would go to the land of the Christians and bring them back based on the fact that they had diplomatic relationship with the Christians. And so that moment was a tense moment where the Muslims had to prove themselves. The Muslims had to be able to speak for themselves, to establish their identity, and at the same time to get their right of refuge. In this moment, the da'wah was dependent upon the ability of the believers to make clear what Islam is and to weigh harm and benefit. Out of all of the tafsir that I read, the only imam that defined hikmah as being weighing harm and benefit, يعني الموازنة بين المصالح والمفاسد, was Imam al-Biqai. Imam al-Biqai, he talked about this being the understanding of weighing harm and benefit. Everybody else, they had yatafalsafun, they have all kind of philosophies that they bring to define what hikmah is, and it doesn't speak to the occasion. Now you have to remember that the Muslims, for years and years, there was no concept of da'wah. If you're living in a Muslim world and you're living with Muslims, generation upon generation, there's some ayat of the Quran that just are not going to make any sense. Now this ayat takes a completely different spirit and understanding for us, because this ayat for us takes us to the beginning of the da'wah itself, not to the position of the Muslims living in Muslim majority land, where we look at it and we say, okay, you know, but we have Islam, we have the adhan, we have the masajid. But when you look at the meaning, here that Allah tabaraka wa ta'ala, when He's talking about the sabil, it means that every effort that we have to make should be made in order to ensure that we're dealing with the issue of the education of Islam, that we're dealing with the issue of maintaining our deen, that we're dealing with the issue of maintaining our families, that we're dealing with the issue of maintaining our iman. Every effort has to be taken. And of those efforts that we can see that are clear is the necessity to have strong, sound institutions. Up to now, we don't have that. We're in a position where maybe after, and this is something that's very important when we talk about the issue of the dawah. There's about 3 years left, and we will hit 25 years into the 21st century. That's a whole generation. And then the second 25 years will begin, which will mean a new generation will come. After that, there will be 50 years of this new century. Some of us will be here, and some of us will not be here. We're dropping as it is with COVID. So then the reality of the da'wah comes back to the issue, how is it that our institutions will maintain themselves, and how is it that our children will maintain the deen, and how is it that we're thinking about the preservation of the Muslim community? That's a serious question. That's not a question that we say, well, yeah, the Sheikh is about to ask us for funds. That's not a question that we say, oh, well, it's almost time to go back to work. When you look at the reality of the Muslim community globally, and you take the percentage of Muslims that have been struck by poverty, you take the percentage of Muslims that have been struck by war, you take the percentage of Muslims that are refugees, you take the whole issue of disease and so on and so forth, and then you take the impact that all of that has had on the Muslim community as far as their mental and spiritual health, then the question that we face One is our existence. You understand what we're saying? Our existence. Imam Izzuddin Abdul Salam, he considered that if the Imam goes on the minbar and he doesn't address the issues of the time, he considered that to be a crime before Allah wa ta'ala. You get what I'm saying? So the point being is that what we call khitab ad-dini, when we talk about the way that we talk about Islam itself, if the khitab ad-dini la yukhatib al-nas بأحوالهم وبالهم يعني هذا الخطاب خطاب باطل. And that's the majority of how it is that we talk about Islam. It has no relationship to our lives. It has no relationship to our condition. It has no relationship to what it is that we should be doing in the moment. That's one. The second is that the way that we talk about Islam has nothing to do with our development as human beings. For the most part. And so when we look at what it was that first generation built, that was a generation that went from Jahiliyyah to Hadara. It went from Jahiliyyah to civilization. It went from a community that was disrupted to an organized community. It went from a people that couldn't organize its affairs to a people that was organized. It went from a people that had corrupt leadership to a people that had just leadership. It went from a people that was drowned in the materialism of the dunya to a people of balance who knew how to keep the souk and who knew how to keep the masajid. And if you look at the life of Umar radiallahu anhu, and you see the logic of Umar and how it was that Umar thought about the future of the ummah, and how it was that Umar thought about the education of the ummah, and how it was that Ali thought about the education of the children. How many of us know that when the Muslims went to Iraq and when their children began not to speak the Arabic language the way that the Arabs of Jazirat al-Arab spoke it, when they began to have lahan, when they began to have mistakes, then the story goes that Abu Aswad al-Du'ali was commissioned to begin dealing with the codification of the Arabic language. And we know the story that when they feared that the written Quran, that the Quran as it was preserved in writing, but it was scattered, it was not brought together. And when the Quran that was memorized in the hearts of the Hufad, when they felt that that was in danger, then that Mus'haf right there was the Mus'haf Uthmani that ultimately was codified. At every step the Muslims had what we call bu'd an-nadhr. Imam Abu Hanifa rahmatullahi alayh, he was known to be an imam that used to think about the future of the Muslim community. He was an imam that used to paint the scenario, if this happens, how is it that we're going to function? He was a strategist. He was a builder. He was the one that gave us the model of different disciplines, yani at-takhasusat mukhtalifa. That he used to bring people from every different takhasus, different ways of learning, different skill sets, bring them together and make sure to come to a decision as to what is the best decision as to how the Muslims should operate. That is how you build an ummah. That is the meaning of the dawah. The meaning of the dawah is not to get caught up on the names of Allah and this one fights this one. The issue of at-tafriqa, the issue of sectarianism, yani as-sara' al-madhabi. You understand what we get as an end result of that? As different madhabs fighting each other. The end result that we get is the destruction of the ummah itself. That's not the goal of the dawah. The other issue that comes up is when Allah Tabaraka wa Ta'ala is talking about al-maw'idat al-hasanah. This means that now when we're talking about educating on the deen, not only is the issue of language important, but the issue to make sure that the Muslims are understanding what it is that they're practicing. People complain and they say, well, this is the time period. يعني اتجهوا الشباب إلى الإلحاد, they say. The youth now, they are going to atheism and so on and so on. It's not that the youth are going to atheism, people. It's that the level of knowledge that we have in the Muslim community in America, for the majority of the Muslim ummah, and it's not to belittle anybody, but it doesn't even befit a second grade education. So if we have worse than a second grade education on Islam and how to be Muslims and the meaning of the Quran, and the Dawah is full of back and forth, and you send them to the university, which is a system that's organized with professors that have dignity. It's not like the Mashaykh in the Ummah. That professor is a professor that's established. That professor is a professor that's muhtaram. Even to the point that what do we prefer? Do we prefer the title of Sheikh, or do we prefer the title of Doctor? So when those youth go into that institution, the dawah that they're going to get is not the dawah that's going to build them. It's up to us, believers, to invest in the dawah to that extent where we begin to focus on other things. Like we begin to focus on building strong masajid with endowments, that we begin to focus on research, that we begin to focus on education for real. If the deen has value, why is it that we find that we don't value the knowledge of Islam? But if it comes with a price tag and it comes with a degree and it gets us somewhere in the economy, then where do we go? We go to what benefits us in the economy. And so when we look at the other sections of this ayah, وَجَادِلْهُمْ بِالَّتِي هِيَ أَحْسَنُ. Here now is, what is our relationship to all of these ideas which go against Islam? What is our position to those who differ with us? How is it that we educate on the reality of the deen? Here, the ayah of the Quran is calling us to engage with al-mukhalif, that person that we differ with, in the best of ways. So if the Quran is calling us to deal with those who differ with us, like in the case of the people of the book, in the best of forms, then what about how it is that we deal with each other? And what form is it that we're dealing with each other? And so in closing, we say this. The Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, there was no stage of the dawah that he operated without any purpose, without any direction, without any organization. And what we call the dawah back then is building a Muslim community and calling the people to come into Islam. The two parts are together. The dawah is not just that we're calling the non-Muslim to come into Islam. The dawah is that we're actually building our community. The dawah is that what? We're explaining Islam to the new Muslim. The dawah is what? That we're making sure that our families are on point. The dawah is that we're making sure our masajid are established. The dawah is making sure that we're educating the youth. The dawah is making sure that we have an understanding of how we operate in the marketplace so that we have the upper hand for ourselves. The dawah is making sure that we have an understanding that together when we cooperate, we have more opportunities than when we go against each other. The dawah is preparing our youth so they go to the next stage when they're getting ready to get married. The dawah is that we're planning for all of these old people in our community that are alone, that have no one to take care of them, and that many of them may have to go into senior housing. The dawahs that we take all the youth that are in child protective services, whether they're refugees or children that were taken away from Muslim families, and we come up with a solution rather than saying, well, adoption is haram in Islam. If we're talking about the dawah people, we're talking about yani hifz al-deen wa hifz baqa al-muslimin. And if we're talking about preservation of the Muslim community itself and preservation of the deen, it's not enough. Because the maqasid of the Sharia didn't just come to preserve the deen. The maqasid of the Sharia came also to ensure that there's tatawwur, that there's development, that there's culture, that there's civilization. And like we said, every angle is open to the issue of the dawah. But we're lacking in the issue of writers. We're lacking in the issue of movies. We're lacking in the issue of the arts. We're lacking in having a voice in research. We're lacking in having a position in the economy. So we have to correct the understanding of what it is that we call da'wah to Allah tabaraka wa ta'ala. أقول قولي هذا واستغفر لي ولكم والحمد لله رب العالمين. اللهم صل على محمد وعلى آل محمد كما صليت على إبراهيم وعلى آل إبراهيم وبارك على محمد وعلى آل محمد كما باركت على إبراهيم وعلى آل إبراهيم في العالمين إنك حميد مجيد. We have something that's called fiqh al-awlawiyat. Something that's called understanding what are the priorities. And we said the hikmah in the context that we were talking in is knowing how to weigh harm and benefit. There's no way that we're going to know how to weigh harm and benefit if the issue is not studied. And if we weigh harm and benefit, there's no way that we're going to take benefit from that if we have no sense of priorities. Our priority has to be to ensure that our masajid have continuity. Our priority has to be to make sure that our families are healthy. Our priorities have to be to make sure that we ourselves are not breaking down mentally. Our priority has to be that our iman is that which we take some benefit from our ibadah. Our priority means that every angle that we take our lives from has something to do with our identity as Muslims. If we're not clear on our identity, if we're not clear on our strategy and our sense of direction, then there's no way that we're going to be able to talk about a future for this ummah. It's not an issue that we can just leave. And so we end by saying that we have a lot of opportunity to be able to organize ourselves better. We have a lot of opportunity to be able to come into being the ummah that we should be. But we have to believe in the concept first. You have to believe in yourself first, oh believers. And I close with saying this. Yani min sifat akh al-Muslim. From the qualities of the Muslim is sifat al-quwwa. Is the quality of power. But what are we talking about when we talk about power? We're not talking about grabbing power. We're talking about your abilities. For you to develop your abilities as a human being. And all of your potential and all of your talent. And taking everything you do to the next level. Whether it's in business. Or whether it's in education. Or whether it's in law. Or whether it's in medicine. Or whether it's at the gas station. To take everything that you're doing to the next level. That is the reality of ihsan. If it's done for Allah tabaraka wa ta'ala. And if it's done with empowering the ummah, then inshallah we're on our way to revival, to tajdeed and islah. أقول قولي هذا واستغفر لي ولكم والحمد لله رب العالمين. We ask Allah tabaraka wa ta'ala to protect us from this virus. We ask Allah tabaraka wa ta'ala to protect our economy. We ask Allah tabaraka wa ta'ala to open the doors of rizq. We ask Allah tabaraka wa ta'ala to make our iman thabit. We ask Allah tabaraka wa ta'ala for all of those that are in the hospital. We ask Allah tabaraka wa ta'ala for all of those that have died and gone before us in iman. We ask for all of those that are having problems in their marriages. And we ask Allah tabaraka wa ta'ala to preserve our youth. And we ask Allah tabaraka wa ta'ala to give us a sense of vision and direction, and to give us the risk of being able to cooperate with one another. And we ask Allah tabaraka wa ta'ala to give us an understanding of what it means to call to his deen. Aqimus salah.